So I've been following the Q Union hashtag on Twitter, and one of my favorites was from a bright student somewhere in the country also going through this event, and it was, "Fully expect my professors to lecture in only 9-minute increments per class now." Unlike your professors, I only have 9 minutes. I don't have a full class period, but I have chosen the topic of civility. And the interesting thing was the best example that I could think of civility happening in recent times actually came from the presidential debate on Sunday. And if you were able to physically endure 90 minutes of cringing at every comment, you might have heard the very last question that was just slid in there by the moderators. And it came from a man named Carl Becker, who said, "My question to both of you is, regardless of the current rhetoric, would either of you name one positive thing that you respect in one another?" In that one question, Carl Becker summed up the idea of civility, that amidst disagreement at some basic level, we can respect one another. At the moment, it seems like our nation has lost track of this idea. But as an individual like Carl Becker has taught us, it still exists. There is a hunger in our society to engage on difficult issues and to have civility in these conversations. We just need to have a better picture of what civility is and an understanding of the constructive ways by which we can implement this day to day. And that's what we'll be talking about today. So I was a debater in high school, and the one thing I learned was to define your terms at the beginning, so there was no loss or confusion throughout the rest of the speech. So the dictionary defines civility as polite, reasonable, and respectful behavior, which is vague and general enough to mean absolutely nothing to society nowadays. Where a dictionary gets us a better picture of what civility is, a more robust understanding of it, is actually when it talks about its Latin root, which is civitas, meaning city, or civis, meaning citizen. The very essence of civility is tied to participating in our nation, in our city. For the ancient Greeks, their city, these areas of participation, was called the Stoa. It was an open area marketplace where men would come together, discuss religion, politics, anything of public value. The Romans had a similar concept with the Forum. And today, it exists in the form of the conversations we have on social networks and even on college campuses like the one that we're situated on right now. But our society, unfortunately, has misunderstood the idea of civility, and it's traded it in for this idea of tolerance. Specifically on college campuses, this crops up in the idea of safe spaces. Now, a Gallup poll from March shows that college students are reacting to these areas and this conversation in an interesting way. 54% of US college students say that campus climate prevents some people from saying what they believe because others might find it offensive. We've lost the idea of civility. See, where we have the idea of civility and the differences between tolerance comes to the fact that you have your opinion and I have mine, and there's a divide in between us, which, for the illustration, is the stairs. Now, the way by which tolerance and these ideas of safe spaces tries to figure out this difference is just by saying, I'm going to try not to offend you. Keep a distance, surround myself in a safe space that I have my own opinion, I have like-minded people around me, and I don't have to argue or feel I'm in a defensive mode. But as college students have figured out, that doesn't work. It's not going to help us engage in the conversations. It's not going to bring about unity. It's not going to be able to allow us to share our ideas and different experiences, which is where civility bridges that gap. Civility serves as a bridge by which we can go and engage in people on their own conversations, on their ideas. We can still hold ours, and we can engage with other people. And if it's available, and if that's a possibility, we can sometimes meet in the middle and compromise. Civility serves as a bridge where tolerance and safe spaces say just keep a distance and don't offend the other person. So now we've got an understanding of what civility is, how do we bring that about? I think it comes down to the 3 C's of constructing civility, created by yours truly. The first is an idea of courage. Civility takes courage, and I mean this in 2 senses. It takes courage, first of all, to have an opinion. As Christians are finding out, we often go against the grain of society. We're often in the minority with our opinions. So to have the courage to hold Christian truth and to keep that and be firmly planted in that takes courage. And that's the first step to civility, is having the belief and the firm foundation in your own ideas and understandings. But the second understanding of courage in this sense of civility actually comes from having the courage to sometimes back away from the argument. Sometimes we have to have the courage to lose the battles to win the war. And I experienced this just a couple weeks ago when I went with a friend to Olive Garden. We were talking about dating relationships in college, and somehow that turned into a conversation on the merits of marriage. And did it matter there was a piece of paper that binded two individuals together? And after about 30 minutes of going through the topic multiple times, I rather eloquently was just ending up saying, it's a very important piece of paper. Well, at that point, I had a decision. I could keep arguing and just being dogmatic about it, or I could say that it was time for me to rethink and re-examine and come back with better arguments. And I think as Christians, it's important to have the courage to sometimes admit that we don't have the complete answer. We haven't completely thought through our own position. We haven't understood another person's experience. And that's okay. It takes courage to take those moments to step back, but it's very important in keeping that bridge connecting us. Which actually brings me to the second C of constructing civility: consideration. I did debate for 6 years in middle school and high school, and the thing I had to do over and over and over again in that experience was argue for positions that I didn't personally hold outside of that resolution, outside of that round. And as Kirsten touched on in her talk with Ross and Gabe, was that it's important to see the other side in building our own and making it stronger. So many times, I think, people have positions that they've taken politically or even personally that comes from something more than just understanding the basic policies of it. Sometimes it comes from personal experience, personal hurts for the decisions that they've made in their lifestyle choices. And oftentimes as Christians, we want to go ahead and engage on these surface-level political positions instead of digging deeper and considering the other person and how their positions were formed. We get on Facebook, we're arguing against it, and we don't realize the hurts, the experiences, the positions that have come about because of something deeper. And as Christians, that's unfortunate. We have an ability to speak truth and life into these situations, but we're just scratching the surface. We don't take time to speak truth and life into deeper personal opinions. So it takes consideration to have civility. The third C that I'd like to talk about is conversation, and this is especially important. We had a student panel just a month ago that talked about racism across the nation and on campus. And one thing that came up across about the 6 or 7 students that discussed it was social media often is a place where instead of having active engagement in debates, we have these angry yelling matches back and forth in all caps. And the problem with that is that as important as it is to engage on all levels as Christians in society, which includes social networks, we often forget to have those physical face-to-face conversations. Civility requires a public, present conversation. Because oftentimes what you'd so easily type out over Facebook or Twitter or respond to somebody, you wouldn't be able to say it to their face. Because standing in front of you would be a person who has emotions, who has their own beliefs, who has their own experiences. And that empathy is something we need to be building, and that can only happen in person, in conversation. That's why the Greeks and the Romans had these conversations face-to-face in a marketplace. It wasn't left to just sending letters back and forth, although that is important as we learn in our history classes. So, when we're looking at the idea of civility, it really does come down to that one question Carl Becker asked. My question to both of you is, regardless of the current rhetoric, would either of you name one positive thing you respect about the other? Regardless of the division our society currently faces, regardless of the differences of opinion, are we able to still respect one another, engage one another, and try to understand one another? And if we can take this more robust understanding of civility out into our conversations and put that into practice using courage, consideration, and conversation, you'll see individuals like Carl Becker more often in the media. You'll see them more often in society. And that's how slowly by slowly culture changes in our nation. So, I'd like to ask you to please be civil.